Hey, good evening. Welcome. Thank you for joining me. Tonight, I want to talk about men and intimacy. Men, we so want connection, love. We want to be seen. We want to have that interplay where we just feel that kind of oneness with another person. We want deep acceptance. All of this is intimacy. We want this so deeply because it's who we are at the core of our very being is connected. And yet, for many of us, we've grown up in a world where we learned not to connect, to isolate ourselves, not to feel. We learned not to feel emotions. Women did that. We learned not to be vulnerable. Women were vulnerable. We learned not to feel the deeper, darker emotions within ourselves. You know, for myself in my earlier years, I learned from my father, which is for most men, we learn from our fathers how to be a man, how to behave, how to think about ourselves, about the world. So I learned from my father's example not to feel my sadness, my grief, my anger, my rage, maybe a little frustration, not to feel my fear. Through his example, through his demonstration, I learned that I could express some joy, some gratitude, some happiness, kind of this very thin, this very narrow margin of expression. And I find this is how it is for so many of us men. This is what we learned, is not to express the most vital life that surges through us, these emotions. When I truly allow myself to feel my grief, there's an aliveness there. There's actually a kind of sweet life in that. It was Phil Donahue who said, "Is it not remarkable that the intimacy that men know for the most part is physical, silent, and predictable? Is it not remarkable that for most men, what we know as intimacy is physical, silent, and predictable?" So physical sexuality, that's our intimacy. Beautiful as it isn't all of it. It's part of it. Silent, when being sexual, we've been taught be quiet. And predictable, constantly coming at it the same way, the same way, the same way we are with life. And that's a little bit what I want to talk about, is I want to invite us to feel deeply. I have some notes that I've brought with me tonight. You know, I trace my experience back of feeling deeply into my emotions back to when I was 23 years old. I started therapy then because I knew something was amiss, something was off, not feeling the depth of my being. So in therapy, I could not differentiate between sad, mad, scared. I could not tell if this was fear or if this was anger, if this was grief. I was so disconnected from my emotions. So where we started was me feeling into my body. Okay, there's a sensation in my chest. It feels warm, it feels tight, it feels painful. And I would then eventually recognize, okay, yes, there's some sadness there. There's some grief there. Feeling into my belly, feeling, oh my goodness, that is my grief. That is my anger, rather, my pain in my belly, eventually feeling that. It took so long for me to finally differentiate sad, mad, glad, and scared. Those different feelings, those are the four basic emotions. Now there's myriad variations on those four, sad, mad, glad, and scared, myriad variations. And yet to assist us in kind of navigating through that watery world, it helps to have these basics to start our course, to begin our journey. In my first therapy session, when I was 23, I worked with a psychologist who was also a hypnotherapist. She took me back to my birth experience. And this was quite profound. I had no memory of my birth experience, at least consciously at that time. So we went back, and I found myself coming through the birth canal into a very bright light, being held firmly by a man I did not know. And in that moment, in the regression, through this birth experience, I had this impression, as though at the moment I'm birthed into the world, an impression like a thought, but kind of more general, that I'm a man, and I'm going to do it on my own. I'm a man, and I'm going to live isolated from all other beings. I'm going to live as an island. And I'm going to isolate myself from all that's within me as well, which is where life surges forth. But as I live as an island, my success is at your cost. And that's the world we live in as men, or the world that I grew up in. The world I grew up in was one where it was an outside job instead of an inside job that my well-being came from. And I invite you to resonate, to feel into this and see if you resonate. Where my well-being came from my accomplishments, how much money I could make. Could I get that other job, car, house, material possessions? And what we've been looking at collectively, what's very alive in the collective right now, is our relationship to women. There was even this kind of prideful misogyny. Could you take a woman? And could you take a woman without her consent? Not that I did, but that was a part of, and we recognize that's very alive today. So as men, you know, we have taken it upon ourselves to first isolate. We've learned that. Did you learn that from your father? Did you learn that from the men in your world? Isolation, and then domination. To dominate everything we have. Nature, each other, women. What has it gotten us? Alone. Isolated, fearful. That's what has gotten us. So we know something doesn't feel right. Something does not. It does not feel good to live this isolated from all of life, which is, we feel at the core of our being, is naturally calling to us, inviting us to connection. So the journey is an inside one. It's time we turn within to feel the life that does surge through us. We want intimacy. We want that connection. That journey is about into me I see. Into me you see. Into me I see. This is the journey we need to take. Helen Keller, blind and deaf, said, avoiding danger, and I say avoiding our feelings, avoiding danger in the long run is no safer than outright exposure. And I say, than outright transparency, being fully alive in your emotions, allowing them to be present, whatever they are. Avoiding danger in the long run is no safer than outright exposure. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. And I'm holding that the daring adventure is right here, that the final frontier, and I'm a Star Trek fan, is right here. I hate to say it, but you got it wrong. It's not out there. This is the final frontier. It's home. This is our home. This is where we need to look. And we are being called to it in every avenue of life. We're being called to come home to ourselves. So how do we do this? Who am I? You know, how do I find out the truth of who I am? So we get to recognize who we're not. Our conditioning. We get to recognize that in the very first few years of life, those formative years, we learned how to think, how to behave. We learned who we are as men, who we are in this world. We learned everything in those first few years, and you can see this is backed up in psychology. In those first few years, we learned all of our conditioning, all the stories about how we should think about ourselves and life. That's our conditioning. And so I like to take a moment and make the distinction of who we are compared to our conditioning. I think of who we are in truth as the hard drive, the part of us that is always present, the part of us that has been with us since birth, and the part of us that is here now is our hard drive. The conditioning, the stories, the emotions, the fantasies, everything that happens in our mind, our bodies, all of that is the software. And the software in those first few years is input into the hard drive. And just like software, we can remove that conditioning. That's our path. You know, if you look at the innocence of an infant, I've got two sons, two amazing young men. And I could watch them as an infant and see that incredible innocence, the incredible aliveness, that incredible presence. If they were happy, they were completely happy, buoyant, loving, inclusive. If they were sad, they were fully in it. If they were hungry, you knew it. Whatever was there, it was right here on the surface. And their very nature was that everything was fully present, everything was fully expressed, and they were bubbles of light, inclusive, loving everybody, in a place of awe. What is this? Curiosity. Oh my God, what's this? What's this? Who are you? Who are you? I mean, when I lead with curiosity, my life opens up. So we get to see from the infants that hard drive, our innocence. We also get to recognize the conditioning and where we've come with our conditioning. So, time to feel our feelings and recognize that within each of us is a purity. It's always been there. And how do we get back to that purity? You know, another way I like to think of it is that if you go to a movie, you're watching the movie on the screen, you see the movie, you know it's not you, it's separate from you, it's a drama, it doesn't matter what type of movie it is, it could be a comedy or tragedy, whatever. You know it's not you. Another way of holding it is that movie screen. The movie is projected onto the movie screen. And no matter what type of movie it is, no matter how long it's there, that screen is not affected by the movie. When the movie's turned off, the screen is still there, just pure, clean. That's a part of us. That is us. Excuse me, that is us. You know, when we were born, there was a part of us that was looking out our consciousness, looking out through our thoughts, illuminating them, looking at our feelings, our fantasies, our bodies, looking at all through us into the world. That part of us we would call I am. I am. Not I am this body, I am this mind, I am these feelings, I am these desires. No, I am. And that was with us when we were born, and it's been with us to this very day. So take a moment, breathe deep, and recognize that part of yourself that has always been the part you would say is I am. Nothing following that. In Eastern mysticism, they call it the witness. We can call it awareness, call it the watcher. It's free of opinion. It's free of identity. It's completely free. When I was 15, I had the huge honor of spending time with Swami Muktananda. And on my third day in his ashram in upstate New York, I had this profound experience, which I want to share with you, which to me demonstrates who I truly am, who you truly are. I was in the meditation hall, and there were perhaps a couple thousand people, and we were singing, and it was just ecstatic. It was so blissful. And my hands were in the air, and it was joyous, joyous. There was a moment, though, where there was a switch from the consciousness that I have always held as contained within this skin, within this body, poof. That separation of this place where I end and everything else begins, that just dissolved. There was an awareness of infinity. A completely still mind, not a thought, not a hint of a thought, not anything, complete stillness. And bliss, absolute bliss, ecstasy, incredible bliss. So I had a still mind. I was aware of infinite consciousness. I was this consciousness. There wasn't even thought to it. There wasn't like, I am this. And it was blissful. And after a while of having this incredibly still, infinite experience, I had the thought, this is awesome. And having that thought, I started to identify. I started to give definition to this experience. And therefore, I started to limit it. See that screen with the movie? Never has that. Doesn't identify with anything. Doesn't define anything. It just sits there watching, pure, infinite. Okay, it's a movie screen. But in us, pure awareness, watching, completely still, not attached. And that's the key to how we can come home to ourselves, is to recognize who we are, bring ourselves back to that, and watch everything else, allow everything else that is within us to be, not to repress it, not to push it down. You see, emotions are nothing to fear. They are just life pulsing, surging through us. Emotions are energy in motion. Energy in motion are emotions. And it is for us in a state of freedom, just like infants, to allow that expression to just come through us. Allow thoughts, allow feelings, allow it all just to be felt, expressed, and move on. That's freedom. And I hold that that is what intimacy is. Where we really go all the way in to me, to see all the way into the truth of who I am. And just like the movie screen, just like when we watch the movie, just like the little baby, we don't push anything away. There's no pushing. There's no rejection. It just is accepted. Where we have our work is that we identify with our story about who we tell ourselves we are, who we tell ourselves you are, what we tell ourselves the world is. We identify with that story, and we're invested in certain aspects of that story. That's where our work is, to recognize where we're invested, where we're identified. You see, the story that we have, where we came from, our history, where we're going, who we are, who you are, it's just a story we made up. It's a thought story. There's actually no life in it. It's just a book. We've created our own book. And yet we imbue it with life. We identify with that. And so it is for us to recognize, well, it's just a story that keeps us trapped in the past, in the future, in fear of all of these things, regret from the past, fear of the future. To breathe deep, to drop in, to recognize that all of this is just fleeting. It's just passing through. It's not who we are. So what I want to invite you into is an up-leveling. And Ken Kai's talked about addictive demand. Addictive demand is like, I'm holding on to this. I'm identified with this, be it this story. I'm invested in it, look this way. This is addictive demand, meaning that if it doesn't show up this way, I'll be minimally disappointed or worse. Then he said to try and just up-level everything to a preference. You walk into an ice cream shop, you really want that chocolate, and you're addictively demanded that you get chocolate, and if they don't have chocolate, you are really upset. You go in with preference, they don't have chocolate, they have vanilla, that's fine. And so to recognize in your consciousness when you have a thought, what you're feeling about that, is it an addictive demand? Can you breathe through it? Can you up-level it to a preference? Just to take that step with all of our conditioning, all of our conditioning. In addition to that, to really recognize the source of who you truly are. Watching the whole, as Muktananda called it, play of consciousness. That to me is real intimacy. That to me is looking and discovering and experiencing the real truth of my being. Now I want to take a look at some of the comments. And let's see what we have here. I see different people who have joined. Then beautiful. If you have a comment now, go ahead and write it in, leave it. If I don't get to your comment now, I'll get to it later. But my wish for you, my wish for all of us, is that we drop in, we relax into who we are, because who we are connected to all of what is, are completely at home in that. Have a beautiful night, y'all.